Hi everyone! Per many people's requests on my prior video for swatching the Naked Reloaded palette by Urban Decay versus the original Naked Urban Decay palette, I am now going to bring you a video where I compare the Naked Reloaded palette to Anastasia Beverly Hills' Sultry eyeshadow palette. So first, if you haven't seen the prior video where I review the Naked Reloaded palette and do comparison swatches to the original, I will link that in the upper right hand corner for you to see. I would suggest that you check that video out if you want to see the swatches for the Naked Reloaded video. I'm not going to redo those swatches in this video. I am instead in this video going to go ahead and swatch the Sultry palette in real time because I've actually never reviewed that on my channel. And then I am going to do a side-by-side comparison to the Naked Reloaded palette. So if you already know what the swatches of the Sultry Anastasia Beverly Hills eyeshadow palette looks like, or if you're just not interested in my thoughts on the quality of the Sultry palette by itself, I will put a timestamp in the description box below for where you can skip ahead to see just the side-by-side swatches and a comparison to the Naked Reloaded palette. Make sure that you are subscribed to this channel by hitting the red subscribe button down below. Also follow Allura Beauty on Instagram. I will put the handle in the description box for you. A giveaway will be running on Instagram shortly. And make sure you check the description box. I will put links to where you can find both the Naked Reloaded palette and the Sultry palette, which at the moment is, I think it's 40% off at Sephora, and a link to Ebates so that if you do make a purchase through Sephora or pretty much any other online retailer, you can get some cash back on your order. Make sure you stay tuned for upcoming videos, and if you could, please leave me a comment in the section below. I've been contemplating starting a new series, something like brands no one ever talks about, because I really would like to start featuring brands on this channel that other YouTubers and channels really don't cover. There are so many brands nowadays, now that the beauty industry has just kind of exploded and the quote-unquote influencer community has exploded. But I don't really know if that's going to be something that people are interested in. So if you would be interested in having a look at brands that you've maybe never heard of before, I would like to know if you would like to see that kind of video. All right, let's get to swatching the Sultry palette and doing a comparison to the Naked Reloaded palette. So let's just look at the Sultry palette as a standalone product by itself. This retails originally for $45. By the time you see this video, it may not be on sale anymore, so that is the full retail price. At some point it was available for $27 at Sephora. This is said to be an essential smoky eyeshadow collection with 14 shades, featuring neutral, cool toned mattes and metallics. And it's also said to be a limited edition palette, although it's been around for a good while. So here is the packaging. It has brown glitter, kind of milk chocolatey brown glitter all over the surface of the palette. It does a pretty good job of not rubbing off, but you will get some flakes here and there. And then there's a tab, but nothing slides out. It is a magnetically closed palette with a mirror inside and with your 2 rows of eyeshadows. You also get a dual-ended brush inside. One end is a blending and buffing side, and one looks more like a packing brush. So here are the eyeshadows inside, and it's nice that you get the names of all of the colors underneath the corresponding pan. As always, I will swatch these with an eyeshadow brush over eyeshadow primer, going left to right, top row to bottom row. Please excuse this mark. This is where I had my hairband, so that will go away eventually, hopefully before this video ends. So let's start by swatching the shade Fresh, and this is a matte ivory pink. Pearl is a metallic pearl white with a soft pink undertone. It swatches really nicely, but perhaps because of the length of the swatch, it kind of dies down at that tail, so I'm just going to add some more product to the tail of the swatch. Steampunk is a metallic topaz bronze. Rose Quartz is a metallic soft peach with a pink shift. Ember is a metallic bronzed khaki. Bloom is a matte coral pink. Birch is a matte mid-toned yellow taupe. Cinder is a metallic cool-toned beige taupe with gold flecks. Twig is a matte mid-toned taupe. Teak is a metallic golden brown. Dystopian is a matte dark ash brown. Cyborg is a metallic silver with a violet undertone. Very interesting color. Slate is a matte slate gray. And Noir is a matte deep black. All right, here are all 14 of your shades in the Sultry palette with a mix basically of completely matte versus metallic shades. Really nothing in between, like no satin finish shades, no glittery shades. I'm very impressed with the Sultry palette. I have to admit that I never was really understanding why people liked this palette so much, because to me it doesn't look visually that appealing, and that's just a personal thing, but I now understand why people adore this palette so much. These shadows are all creamy. They go on smoothly over the skin. You don't need to dig your brush into the pan to get the color to show up vibrantly and strongly and to swatch smoothly. They are just beautiful colors. You get, you know, a good handful of very unique, interesting shades. I do think it is a predominantly cool toned palette. You know, 1, 2, 3, definitely 4, you know, definitely cool toned shades. You only have, maybe even this coral is not like a super warm toned coral. This shade is definitely warm toned, and then this shade is warm toned too, and you know, these two shades. But most of these lean either are neutral or more cool toned. And in general, I like more warm toned shades on my skin, but again, that's a purely personal thing. The quality, I really just don't have anything bad to say in terms of the quality of these shadows. I'm not necessarily sure that I understand the inclusion of this coral in amongst the other shades of this palette. It really seems like an outlier to me, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, again, because it gives you some dimension and just, you know, an extra shade to really play around with and make a different look with. All right, so pretty quickly, not that much similarity in terms of the design of the palettes themselves, though you are probably more concerned about what's inside the palettes. And obviously, besides the very clear visual differences in the palette, you also are getting this duo-ended brush with the Sultry palette, whereas Urban Decay has removed that function or that feature from this Naked palette, whereas in the other Naked 1, 2, and 3 and other versions, they had a either duo-ended eyeliner or a duo-ended brush. So let's just compare visually first before we do swatches. And you can kind of see why people are thinking that these two palettes are kind of similar, especially with the presence of this kind of pop of coral. Now the coral shade in the Reloaded palette looks a lot more muted. It's not as bright or deep as the coral color in the Anastasia Beverly Hills palette. You have kind of your cream shades that you start off with. I don't know if there's really a corresponding warm toned brown like this. This one is more of like a mustard, slightly mustardy brown, so that doesn't really correspond visually, at least. These two shades, I guess, are kind of similar to Birch in the Anastasia palette. I'm just saying visually, although this Barely Baked is a shimmering shade instead of a matte shade like Birch is. I think Birch is kind of a mixture of these two colors in a matte version. And you know, you have kind of maybe like a brighter gold toned-ish shade. Angel Fire looks kind of like Pearl, but is a lighter version of Rose Quartz. Rose Quartz looks kind of like maybe Reputation. There's not really a green toned shade in the Reloaded palette the way Ember looks in the ABH palette. Twig and Bucked are not even really in the same family. Twig is much more gray toned than Bucked, which is more warm toned. Endgame and Dystopian look kind of similar, although Dystopian is deeper. And then you have more of these kind of rusty shades, Reputation and Burn, in the Reloaded palette that don't have really corresponding shades in the ABH palette. So, I mean, I don't really think there's going to be a really close ratio in terms of the shades. You also have Noir, which is a matte black, which you don't have in the Reloaded palette. And, you know, Dreamweaver and Cyborg is much lighter and more silvery. So we'll see in the swatches like how similar we can get in terms of the actual colors and finishes. I don't actually think at the end of the day that it will be that similar. That's my guess before actually doing the swatches. I think that people are kind of making a reaction that these seem similar more because they're just generally neutral palettes with a mix of cool and warm tones. Although I think the ABH palette seems to me overall to be more cool toned, neutral to cool toned. But I think people maybe have this reaction because there's this pop of coral in an otherwise neutral seeming palette. But that said, let's go ahead, take a jump in and do the swatches. Okay, so at the top you have the Sultry palette swatches, which I redid, and on the bottom you have the Naked Reloaded swatches. So hopefully this kind of shows you what I mean. I don't know that these are super similar. They're definitely in the same family of neutral palettes with a pop of coral, but I wouldn't really say that it's kind of a dupe or even like a half dupe of a palette. You know, you have maybe these cool toned silvery shades that, I don't know, sort of mirror each other. Obviously, the most similar thing is these coral shades. The one in the Reloaded palette is more of a peach, and the one in the Anastasia Beverly Hills palette is more of a bright, something more pink toned pop. So yeah, obviously that's a clear overlap. Maybe these two shades are somewhat similar, although again, like I said before, this is more mustardy. That one in the Anastasia Beverly Hills palette, you don't have a pop of khaki in the Reloaded palette. So, you know, got some matte, deeper brown shades that you probably couldn't tell the difference if you put one on one eye and the other on the other eye. So, sure, you know, they're both neutral palettes, but I wouldn't say that buying one would be a replacement for buying the other. But what I will say is that if you own the Sultry palette already, and especially if you own the Naked Original palette, I don't really think you're going to be that impressed by the Naked Reloaded palette. The Naked Reloaded palette is not a bad palette by any means, but these swatches did take more effort. I had to dig my brush in the pans more than I did with the Sultry palette. These swatches go on less creamy, they go on more dry. You have two pretty problematic shades when it comes to dry swatching, which is this shade here, Angel Fire, and this shade here, Dreamweaver. These shades need to be applied with your finger or a dampened brush. Otherwise, they are very flaky, very dry, and they need to be layered and pressed into the skin with a brush. So that is not something that you're going to have to struggle with when it comes to the Sultry palette. You don't have to dig in, re-swatch, layer, or do any of that kind of thing with any of the shades in the Sultry palette. It's just overall a higher quality palette, hands down. And lastly, with the Sultry palette, you get 14 different shades for $45. With the Reloaded palette, you get 12 shades for $44. So you're getting more shades to work with in the Sultry palette for basically the same amount of money. You do get more product overall with the Reloaded palette than you do with the Sultry palette, if my math is correct. But I don't know that nowadays people just, they don't get through palettes, period. So I don't know really how much of a difference that will make. But if you are the kind of person who only has one palette that you use every day and you are going to get through it, then maybe that's an important consideration for you. So let's just take a final look up close to compare these two palettes. You can see the Sultry palette, you know, those metallic shades, they just have a more bright, kick of metallic sheen to them even than the ones in the Reloaded palette. Please leave me a comment in the comment section below. Let me know what you think. Have you tried the Sultry palette, or have you been waiting to purchase it? Do you have both of these and have more thoughts on the comparisons, overlaps, and an opinion on which palette is better? I hope that this was helpful and interesting to you. If you have a couple seconds, please give the video a thumbs up. As always, thank you so much for taking your time to watch this video, and I'll see you in the next one.